Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time and to the rest of the committee as well. For the record, I'm Clarence Lamb, delegate in District 12. I have a bill here today, HB 839, that concerns electric drive vehicles. And this was an issue that had been brought up to me by some constituents who lived in Columbia. There are quite a few electric charging stations in Columbia, some nearby Columbia Station gyms in my district, and it was brought to my attention as a concern. And some counties have taken steps to address this, and this would hopefully help address this on the state level. So, speaking to the wisdom of this committee, last year we passed a bill on Tesla and promoting electric vehicle charging stations for those types of vehicles throughout the state. If you think about it and think about these electric vehicles, the concern for many of these electric vehicle drivers are the range that they can go on their batteries. And there's actually a term for this called range anxiety. And so for many of these drivers, they love their vehicles. They're driving throughout the state. The batteries range quite differently from, maybe 20 miles on just EV charge up to, 100 or 200 on a Tesla. But inevitably, all of them face this similar concern that you see here, which is the indication of a very low battery. And so, when this pops up, they try to look for the nearest charging station. Ideally, this is what they would find. They'd find an electric vehicle charging station that they can hook up to. But sometimes what they find is something like this, where it is a non-electric vehicle car parked in a clearly designated electric vehicle space. And so, this is obviously a concern for these drivers where, they might be going on a trip to a local strip mall and running out of EV power, really needing to be able to charge that up at one of the public charging stations that's available and accessible to people, but they come up to a situation like this where there are two clearly non-EV vehicles, so these are internal combustion vehicles, or some folks will use the abbreviation ICE, so these are ICE engine vehicles, parked in EV vehicle spaces. And so what this does is try to address and keep those spaces open for electric vehicles, because we understand that they do have a real need to be able to charge up in some of these publicly accessible charging stations. The concern here is that with the prevalence of electric vehicles increasing, which is a good thing, we are seeing increasing instances where there have been conflicts amongst drivers of electric vehicles and those of internal combustion vehicles. And this has become more prevalent, and it is something that's, in some cases, risen to threats of violence or actual violence itself. So we've heard instances where people have keyed other people's vehicles, there are altercations as drivers exit their vehicles, there are nasty notes that are left. Here's an example that I'd found of folks trying to take this into their own hands and using what they call ICE shaming, which is putting a note on a driver's vehicle to indicate that they should not be parked in that space. In a way, really confronting those folks, but, this is leading to challenges of conflicts and violence. Here's an example. This one's actually of Maryland. It's a Maryland vehicle. But, this is what you see at the bottom is actually an example of something someone might print out and leave at a windshield of a driver like this. And so it's a very real concern for a lot of folks. And so, in thinking about this, what can we do to help address this concern? My proposed solution, and hopefully one that we can look a little bit more closely at, is the reserved parking or the handicap parking signs that you see available at so many different parking spaces, and creating a very similar designation for electric vehicle charging spaces. So that's what this bill does. It allows for vehicles that are internal combustion engine vehicles that are parked in clearly designated electric vehicle charging spaces to be able to be cited or towed, and there would be a civil penalty of up to $100 for a vehicle that's illegally parked in these types of spaces. The bill does have certain standards for signage and also designated what are some reserved parking spaces for electric vehicles. It also clarifies that oftentimes there are local zoning ordinances that designate the number or the ratio of handicap spaces to the overall number of spaces. We had heard some concerns from people that have large parking lots that there would be question as to whether or not these charging spaces would count towards the overall number of spaces and how that could affect that ratio for ADA requirement purposes. So it does clarify in the bill that these would count to the overall number of spaces that a parking lot has. I was fortunate to have been appointed to the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council that this committee a few years ago had stood up. And as the House designee, this was one bill that I had brought up before the council at its last meeting in December. The council itself is actually working through transitions in staff, and so they weren't able to secure a letter that would explicitly support this bill. They are working through clearance, and we're hopeful to be able to have a letter of support next week. But this is, a line that comes from the minutes of the last EVIC meeting, indicating that they do support in principle these types of bills. The one designated here as stopping and standing bills. So again, a very straightforward bill, and I think one that really would help support the growing electric vehicle community. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to members of my panel, some of whom are members of EVIC, and I certainly appreciate their willingness to show up here to testify in support of this. And let me turn it over to them. Thank you.
Great. Who would like to go first?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Lanny Hartman, and this is the fourth time that this issue has come before the legislature. And what's different this time? Well, as Delegate Lamb mentioned, Montgomery County and Howard County have passed similar laws to address this. And I worked with the county councils at both of those counties to help pass this law in those places. And he explained very well the issue that we face when we come to a charging station that's blocked by a gasoline vehicle. And what this law will enable is to avoid those conflicts and allow someone to resolve it by simply calling the police and let them handle it. But an important element is that in order to be enforceable, it has to conform to the language in the law. And there was 3 amendments that we have recommended, and I'll speak with 2 of them. As far as the signs, in Montgomery County and Howard County, the language simply says that it must conform to the standards, which is basically the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And that's what I support in the amendment number 2 that we've presented. And the other is a requirement to have green pavement markings, and that's simply what it says in the law is right now. And I think green pavement markings is a great idea, but I do not think it should be legislated at the state level. I did some research, and surprisingly, the blue rectangles that you see at ADA parking spaces is not required by federal law, nor is it required by the state of Maryland. It's voluntary, or it's regulated at the local level. So I recommend that be taken out in order to make it easier for parking facilities to conform to this, so that more of these charging station parking spots would be covered under this law. Thank you.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Scott Wilson. I'm a member of the Maryland Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council, and I'm also Vice President of the Electric Vehicle Association of Greater Washington, D.C. I also drive a 2014 Nissan Leaf. It's my second one. I've been driving since 2012. This is a problem that's going to that's showing up now, and it's going to get it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better, because right now in Maryland there are about something around 6,000 electric vehicles, and more high mileage, high range cars are on the way. So these are going to be becoming more and more popular. And people, when you have an electric car, the majority of the time you charge it at home, but you also charge it out in public. So this icing issue is going to keep on reoccurring as more cars are on the road. I think I've been iced before, and I think the vast majority of gas cars that park in the spaces are doing it because they're not aware that that's an electric vehicle space. That they're not doing it out of spite, they're doing it out of unawareness. As far as the signage requirement in the bill, I think it's also good to require standard signage. Those signs would be affordable and easily obtainable because the installers are using those signs now. When they install a station, the installer puts the sign up, shows the owner what's available, and it's working well in Montgomery County and Howard County with their signage. And lastly, I would say that as far as marking the pavement, I agree with what Lanny said. It probably would not. I wonder if it would be wise to require that. It turns out that the spaces are being painted now, and in a variety of levels. Some are very elaborate, some are very simple, and you kind of have to customize it for each individual location. So I would be very careful about requiring certain things in all spaces. Right now,
Okay.
it's kind of customized.
If you could, okay, thank you. Who'd like to go next?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Mark Chaika, and I'm a resident of Charles County, Maryland. I'm the director of MD Volt, a Maryland nonprofit promoting education and awareness of electric vehicles and charging stations through meetups and events, primarily in Maryland. I own a plug-in hybrid Ford Fusion and a fully electric Chevy Spark EV, which I'm proud the motors are made up in White Marsh, Maryland. I support HB 839 with the amendments that have been listed. Icing is a problem that creates anxiety for electric vehicle owners. Some EV owners have gone to great lengths to charge their EVs, from using expensive extension cords to parking illegally, as you can see in these photographs. And these are both in Maryland, by the way, Baltimore and Columbia. Icing of an EV space is equivalent to pulling into a gas station where every pump is full and having to wait an indeterminate amount of time, especially if there are no alternative charging locations close by. I've experienced icing in Charles County at the local Mom's Organic Market, but it wasn't a serious issue because the other space was available. But I could imagine being an apartment tenant that does not have charging at my residence and has to go out and use these public stations, and I can't get into the space and charge the car. This could be a potentially problem where somebody can't get to work the next day, if you will. It can take some time. And it can potentially strand them as well. When you have a limited range EV of 80 to 100 miles and want to go on a long trip, there is some planning that needs to be done, of course, but an icing event could put a wrench into your plans. Thank you for introducing HB 839, making icing one less thing an EV owner will have to worry about.
And who's the final witness?
Chairman Brav, members of the committee, my name is Robert Erdman.
It's Barve, rhymes with Oive.
Sorry, Barve.
Go ahead.
I support HB 839 with the three amendments that we have also in our written testimony. My wife and I are owners of a Volt, which my wife drives to work. And every now and then she needs to get it charged, and there's a charger nearby. It was very disappointing when she goes there and it's blocked by a gasoline vehicle. And this bill would help to solve that problem. And in addition, the organizations that put in the chargers, you know, when it's blocked, they either lose revenue or the charging station doesn't serve the purpose that it was meant to. So I think everyone else covered what I wanted to say, so I'll just end with I respectfully request a favorable report.
Before I recognize, there are 4 questions. Before I recognize them, if you have a Leaf, since you own a Leaf, or whoever it was who owns the Leaf, so what's the difference between the amount of time for fast charging and the amount of time for plugging it into a standard wall socket?
Well, the standard, in my garage, I have a 240 volt. It's called level 2, and that adds 30 miles. That adds 15 miles every hour it's plugged in. Fast charging adds, it will charge 80%, so it give you like 70 miles in a half hour.
And what if you just plugged it into one of these wall sockets?
That gives you 5 miles per hour of charging.
Got it. Okay. First question goes to Delegate Lafferty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, if I may, I have a couple of questions. The first one was for Mr. Hartman. You described the Howard County signage. Is that the only thing that the Howard County law addresses? Is it simply the sign?
Yes.
So they're not getting into any of the other regulatory aspects. It's simply the size of the sign.
They require the sign to be at least 12 by 18 inches.
No, I
And for it to
understand. You
conform.
said that in your written testimony. I thank you very much for that. Do they have a penalty for failing either to have such a sign or for someone who occupies an EV space?
The sign is not required. It's voluntary on the private property owner to erect a sign that conforms to the standards. So if the private property owner does not want to have this enforced on his property, he does not have to erect a standard sign.
Do you know, since there are EV stations at the county office building, whether or not they have any regulations for their own property?
The law in Howard County was originally, the intent was for it to cover county property as well as private property. And an amendment was recently introduced. In fact, it's going to be voted on next week to amend that to cover not only county property, but specifically in the language to clear it up for private property as well, that's accessible by the public.
So to clarify that, and I think that is accurate, the Howard County Council had passed a resolution that they thought had addressed both private and public parking lots and spaces. And through a drafting error, they realized after the resolution was passed that it, depending on the interpretation of it, it didn't actually cover private lots. And so they're now going back to amend that and fix that. I believe the resolution they did pass had an enforcement or penalty in it for people who are parking in those spaces, to answer your earlier question.
Okay, I appreciate that. And if I may, Mr. Chair, just follow up. Does the way the bill is drafted, I see there's a civil penalty of $100, but if an individual pulls up to a space and it's occupied by a vehicle that's not EV, what is that individual's recourse?
I'm sorry, are you asking me?
Anyone, the sponsor. That'd be
Sure.
great.
So their recourse, this is a law that would have to be enforced by law enforcement. So there would need to be a member of law enforcement that would be able to cite that vehicle. An individual private citizen would not be able to cite someone, obviously.
So if I had an EV and pulled up and found that the stations were occupied, I could call the police and ask them to issue a civil citation, civil penalty?
Yeah, you would. Like in Montgomery County, you call the police non-emergency number, you report a parking violation, and then it's enforced and the citation's written.
Okay. And last question, if I may, it goes to the sponsor. Doug Lamb, and by the way, having worked at the Howard County office building, I really appreciate that you're attending to this issue because I think it is only going to grow as a problem. And seeing non-EV vehicles in their spaces, but yet they didn't take any action against them. The last provision on page 3, lines 17 through 21, have to do with being counted towards the overall number of parking spaces in a parking lot. Shouldn't that be left to the local land use and planning decisions as to whether or not they want to require additional spaces or whether they want to allow them to be counted towards the entirety?
Sure. So I guess our concern, this was trying to address a concern that had come up during the EVIC discussion, which was coming from commercial owners and strip center owners that were concerned that they had met the ratio that was required of the local ordinance, but then with this being implemented, that they weren't sure if these EV vehicles would count towards the overall number of spots or not, and if they didn't count towards the overall number of spots, and that would drop them under the ratio that they would be required to have for handicap spots out of the total proportion of overall spots to meet the ADA requirements. And so, we were hoping to be able to address that through that provision that you're citing there, but, I'm open to discussions on where that might be best addressed.
Okay, thank you.
Just before I recognize the next person, and I don't know the answer to this, with handicap, with people who park in a handicap spot illegally, do we have the ability to take a photograph and send it to the police? Does anybody know the answer to it? Well, we'll ask legal staff counsel about that. Next question, Delegate Folden.
The short answer is no. You can take a picture of anything, but I don't know that they'll enforce it, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. So I just want to clarify one point that was made because I don't know exactly what your name was, sir, so I apologize. But it was the gentleman that was talking about that there wouldn't be a requirement to paint the asphalt and have signage. And I want to be clear that COMAR, are you familiar with COMAR, Code of Maryland? And that COMAR does require that for enforcement, that, for example, for handicap spaces, that they have to have signage and be painted, asphalt. So, for example, a fire lane has to have signage and yellow curbs, or it's not enforceable. Handicap has to have signage and blue and the logo on the asphalt. So it's not enforceable. I like what you're doing here. I mean, my wife has a hybrid vehicle, so she'll love to hear something about this. But I just want to make sure that you're checking out exactly what you're going to need for this, because for an enforceable standpoint, police officers look at something from a signage and basically, is it signed and is it painted? It has to have both.
Exactly, and that's what I was alluding to, that in order, the method that you designate the spot is important here. And we want to simplify it with these amendments to require basically just one sign that conforms to the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, and that will harmonize it with the two local laws that are already in place.
Well, what I'm telling you, what I'm saying though, sir, is that the state of Maryland, you had made the comment that there's no requirement for it to be painted. And for the enforcement standpoint through COMAR, there is a requirement that it be signed and painted for an enforcement standpoint. So if I pull up to a handicap spot and someone has a sign there, but it's not painted on the asphalt, that's not a citable offense, believe it or not. Most people don't understand that, but it has to be both. In the event that the sign...
And as a sponsor, I certainly appreciate that insight. I think that's helpful. So you're saying that to speak to the consistency of other parts of the code,
Exactly.
having this both painted and signed would make it consistent with handicap parking and fire lanes.
Absolutely. Yep. That's all I'm saying. Just make sure that what you're putting out there is consistent and the application is uniform then. There is no, is it put up by the landowner then, or is it enforceable through state statute? Because that's what you're asking, because most of these places are on private property, and most of the time, police enforcement action cannot occur on private property unless there's summons there. And a part of that paradigm must be signed and painted. So just so you're aware. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate what you're trying to do here, keep internal combustion engine vehicles out of these spaces, because it defeats the purpose of having the space. That makes sense. But how do you keep someone from making these things if they have an electric vehicle, their own personal parking spot? In other words, there's one in downtown Annapolis, parking's at a premium. Someone works here in the state complex, and they drive their electric vehicle and park it in this spot every day because they can't get a spot anywhere else and they're qualified. How do you do that? Have you thought about that?
So we have thought about that. That was, I think, a discussion point before the EVIC Council. That gets into a much more complex issue, which we decided not to try to address as part of this bill, because you're correct that anybody can park in those spots that have an EV vehicle. The question then becomes, in situations where does the car have to actually be hooked up to the charger or not? And if the car is hooked up, does it need to be actively charging or not? Because after a certain period, the battery is fully charged. It's not feeding additional charge into that vehicle. So it gets into some dicey situations where we did not, because of lack of consensus, I think, and many different perspectives, want to get into, do we want to put a time restriction on it? Do we want to say that it has to be actively plugged into the charger? We thought this was a good first step to try to get at the issue. And if there's more additional consensus from the EV community on this, that this is something we can look to in the future.
Sure, that makes sense. I envision you're probably going to have problems along those lines in the future, but I don't know what the answer is. All right, thanks.
If I could just quickly say, there's an etiquette that's being developed among EV drivers, and it's essentially public shaming. And there are apps where they keep track of these charging sites, and if somebody reports, oh, there was somebody there parked and they weren't even charging, it kind of gets around.
Delegate Healy.
Okay, I'm going to ask a different kind of question a little bit. I want to focus on the money side of it. When people use these charging stations, do they pay for the charge at all? Is it provided for free by somebody, the property owner, or
It's a mixture. Some are free. Some are free to attract people, like in a retail location, moms. Right. They're all free, and they get a lot of customers that way. Some are paid. But
then you have the question with turnover, because, I mean, if you have to stay there for a length of time for it to be beneficial, and a lot of shopping centers want turnover. They don't want people parking their car for hours there because they want other people to come to their stores. And they sometimes they ask for, small towns ask for meters to be put in to keep the traffic continuing, and especially in the areas where near, like the University of Maryland, where parking is a premium, and you can't park on campus because there's no parking spaces left. And if you park in one of the parking lots that's free, the owner of that parking lot is going to watch and see if you actually go into one of the stores. I mean, there are people there that they have there to watch that, but. So I guess the question is about financing, about whether you're paying to have one of these stations on your property. It attracts somebody to stay there all day long. You may not want to do that. You don't have to do that under this bill, do you? On private property, you don't have to provide these spaces.
No, you don't. There's no requirement to provide the space. There's no requirement to limit the amount of time. We intentionally left that part of the discussion out of this bill.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the bill, because and the other piece of it is about, so you don't necessarily have to pay to use these stations. Some people it's just free. Just drive up. Does it work like a meter?
You have an account with the company, for example, SemiConnect, which is a Maryland company that manufactures these stations. You have a swipe card, and you wave it on the charger, and it kind of starts the meter in your.
So it's kind of like a credit card operation.
It's similar to that, but it's all wireless. It's
like they do now with some of the parking meters are like that way. That now too, correct?
Yeah, like Easy Pass. That's a good, yeah.
And some of them are completely free of charge. Like I know the one in Columbia in my district, they were able to get that out of a federal grant to put those chargers in and also cover electricity. So some of them are completely free.
And if they're in like a paid parking garage, then that would be like included in the cost of paying to stay in their garage, that you would just plug in whatever they would.
That's the situation in Baltimore County. They're free and you pay for the parking. And
you say pay for the parking the same way everybody else pays for the parking.
Correct.
Whatever terms of, it's $4 a day or $20 a day or whatever it is.
Correct. But in situations where they want to encourage you to charge for a finite amount of time and then move on, that's been addressed by escalating charges. For the first 4 hours, it may be 50 cents an hour, and then it goes up to $2 an hour, $4 an hour, and keeps on escalating. And that motivates people to move their car.
Gotcha. Okay, as long as they're plugged in. But if they park there and they don't plug in and they're just using it because they have that kind of vehicle.
Then that can be addressed by signage with time limits, and that's the situation in Howard County. The spots there have a 4-hour limit.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the information.
Delegate Frazier Hidalgo.
I'm actually fine.
Okay. Well, there appear to be no further questions, and that will end the public, and there's no opposition. That ends the public hearing on House Bill 839. We'll proceed to House Bill 848, also Delegate Lamb.